The next cataclysm, like Noah's 6,500 years ago, like Adam and Eve's 11,500 years ago, this too will come to pass. With the rumble so low as to be inaudible, growing, throbbing, then fuming into a thundering roar, the earthquake starts, only it's not like any earthquake in recorded history. In California the mountains shake like ferns in a breeze. The mighty Pacific rears back and piles up into a mountain of water more than 2 miles high, then starts its race eastward. With the force of 1,000 armies the wind attacks, ripping, shredding everything in its supersonic bombardment. The unbelievable mountain of Pacific sea water follows the wind eastward, burying Los Angeles and San Francisco as if they were but grains of sand. Nothing, but nothing, stops the relentless, overwhelming onslaught of wind and ocean. Across the continent the 1,000-mile-per-hour wind wreaks its unholy vengeance, everywhere, mercilessly, unceasingly. Every living thing is ripped into shreds while being blown across the countryside, and the earthquake leaves no place untouched. In many places the Earth's molten sublayer breaks through and spreads a sea of white-hot liquid fire to add to the Holocaust. Within 3 hours the fantastic wall of water moves across the continent, burying the wind-ravaged land under 2 miles of seething water coast to coast. In a fraction of a day all vestiges of civilization are gone, and the great cities, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, Dallas, New York, are nothing but legends. Barely a stone is left where millions walked just a few hours before. A few lucky ones who managed to find shelter from the screaming wind on the lee side of Pikes Peak watch the sea of molten fire break through the quaking valleys below. The raging waters follow, piling higher and higher, steaming over the molten earth fire, and rising almost to their feet. Only great mountains such as this one can withstand the cataclysmic onslaught. North America is not alone in her death throes. Central America suffers the same cannonade, wind, earth fire, and inundation. South America finds the Andes not high enough to stop the cataclysmic violence pounded out by nature in her berserk rage. In less than a day, Ecuador, Peru, and western Brazil are shaken madly by the devastating earthquake, burned by molten earth fire, buried under cubic miles of torrential Pacific seas, and then turned into a frozen hell. Everything freezes. Man, beast, plant, and mud are all rock hard in less than 4 hours. Europe cannot escape the onslaught. The raging Atlantic piles higher and higher upon itself, following the screeching wind eastward. The Alps, Pyrenees, Urals, and Scandinavian mountains are shaken and heaved even higher before the wall of water strikes. Western Africa and the sands of the Sahara vanish in nature's wrath, under savage attack by wind and ocean. The area bounded by the Congo, South Africa, and Kenya suffers only severe earthquakes and winds, no inundation. Survivors there marvel at the sun, standing still in the sky for nearly half a day. Eastern Siberia and the Orient suffer a strange fate indeed, as though a giant subterranean scythe sweeps away the Earth's foundations, accompanied by the wind in its screaming symphony of supersonic death and destruction. As the Arctic Basin leaves its polar home, Eastern Siberia, Manchuria, China, and Burma are subjected to the same annihilation as South America: wind, earth fire, inundation, and freezing. Jungle animals are shredded to ribbons by the wind, piled into mountains of flesh and bone, and buried under avalanches of seawater and mud. Then comes the terrible, paralyzing cold. Not man, nor beast, nor plant, nor earth is left unfrozen in the entire eastern Asian continent, most of which remains below sea level. East of the Urals, in western Siberia, a few lucky people survived the fantastic winds and quakes. Antarctica and Greenland, with their ice caps, now rotate around the Earth in the torrid zone, and the fury of wind and inundation marches on for 6 days and nights. During the 6th day the oceans start to settle in their new homes, running off the high grounds. On the 7th day the horrendous rampage is over. The Arctic Ice Age is ended, and a new Stone Age begins. The oceans, the great homogeneous, have laid down another deep layer of mud over the existing strata in the Great Plains, as exposed in the Grand Canyon, Painted Desert, and Badlands. The Bay of Bengal Basin, just east of India, is now at the North Pole. The Pacific Ocean, just west of Peru, is at the South Pole. Greenland and Antarctica, now rotating equatorially in the torrid zone, find their ice caps dissolving madly in the tropical heat. Massive walls of water and ice surge toward the oceans, taking everything from mountains to plains in gushing, heaving paths, creating immense seasonal moraines. In less than 25 years the ice caps are gone, and the oceans around the world rise over 200 feet with the newfound water. The torrid zone will be shrouded in a fog for generations from the enormous amounts of moisture poured into the atmosphere by the melting ice caps. New ice caps begin to form in the new polar areas. Greenland and Antarctica emerge with verdant tropical foliage. Australia is the new, unexplored continent in the North Temperate Zone, with only a few handfuls of survivors populating its vastness. New York lies at the bottom of the Atlantic, shattered, melted by earth fire, and covered by unbelievable amounts of mud. Of San Francisco and Los Angeles, not a trace is left. Egypt emerges from its Mediterranean inundation new and higher, still the land of the ages. The commonplace of our time becomes the mysterious Baalbek of the new era. A new era. Yes, the cataclysm has done its work well. The greatest population regulator of all does once more for man what he refuses to do for himself, and drives the pitiful few who survive into a new Stone Age. Once more the Earth has shifted its 60-mile thick shell, with the poles moving almost to the equator in a fraction of a day. Again the atmosphere and oceans, refusing to change direction with the Earth's shell, have wiped out almost all life. After this tumble we join Noah, Adam and Eve, Atlantis, Mu, and Olympus, and Jesus joins Osiris, Taroa, Zeus, and Vishnu. The Great Floods. Noah, Adam and Eve, Vishnu, Osiris. What do they have in common? They represent eras ages apart, and yet, somehow, they all join hands in the next cataclysm, and walk with us. There are others who walk with us, too, men of science long forgotten, those who first saw that these tumbles, these cataclysmic catastrophes, or revolutions of the Earth's shell have happened before, countless times. J. de Luc in 1779 and Georges Cuvier in 1812 were the foremost. Dodemier, the famous mineralogist, joined the consensus, as did Escher and Feilds, the Swiss geologists. Also J. de Luc Jr. and Van Buch. They all agreed that the cataclysms were caused by sudden revolutions of the surface of the Earth. Cuvier, in his Theory of the Earth, first published in 1812, based his conclusions on his unparalleled correlative research in stratigraphy, comparative anatomy, and paleontology. At that time he wrote, "Every part of the earth, every hemisphere, every continent, exhibits the same phenomenon. There has, therefore, been a succession of variations in the economy of organic nature. The various catastrophes which have disturbed the strata have given rise to numerous shiftings of this continental basin. It is of much importance to mark that these repeated eruptions and retreats of the sea have neither been slow nor gradual. On the contrary, most of the catastrophes which occasioned them have been sudden, and this is especially easy to be proved with regard to the last of these catastrophes. I agree, therefore, with Mr. Deluc and Dolomeur in thinking that if anything in geology be established, it is that the surface of our globe has undergone a great and sudden revolution, the date of which cannot be much earlier than 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, also one preceding revolution at least to put the continents under water, with perhaps 2 or 3 eruptions of the sea. These alternations now appear to me to form the problem in geology, but it is of most importance to solve. In order to solve it satisfactorily, it would be necessary to discover the cause of these events. These ideas have haunted, I may almost say have tormented me, during my researches among fossil bones, researches which embrace but a very small part of those phenomena of the age preceding the last general revolution of the globe, and which are yet intimately connected with all the others. Many attempts have been made to answer the charge made to the geological profession by Cuvier to explain these sudden revolutions. Among others, Velikovsky tried it through his study of myths and legends. Hapgood tried it. Brown attempted, and in the process amassed a tremendous library of geological data. Every time the cataclysmic concept has come to life, the beast has been stoned, burned at the stake, beaten to a pulp, and buried with a vengeance. But the corpse simply won't stay dead. Each time, it raises the lid of its coffin and says in sepulchral tones, "You will die before I." The latest of the challengers is Professor Frank C. Hibben, who in his book, The Lost Americans, said, "This was no ordinary extinction of a vague geological period which fizzled to an uncertain end. This death was catastrophic and all-inclusive, what caused the death of 40 million animals. The corpus delicti in this mystery may be found almost anywhere. Their bones lie bleaching in the sands of Florida and in the gravels of New Jersey. They weather out of the dry terraces of Texas and protrude from the sticky ooze of the tar pits off Wilshire Boulevard in Los Angeles. The bodies of the victims are everywhere. We find literally thousands together, young and old, foal with dam, calf with cow. The muck pits of Alaska are filled with evidence of universal death, a picture of quick extinction. Any argument as to the cause must apply to North America, Siberia, and Europe as well. Mammoth and bison were torn and twisted as though by a cosmic hand in a godly rage. In many places the Alaska mark blanket is packed with animal bones and debris in trainload lots: mammoth, mastodon, bison, horses, wolves, bears, and lions. A faunal population in the middle of some cataclysmic catastrophe was suddenly frozen in a grim charade. Fantastic winds, volcanic burning, inundation and burial in muck, preservation by deep freeze. Any good solution to a consuming mystery must answer all of the facts, challenges Hibben. The challenge wouldn't leave me alone. Like a hunger, it gnawed at my subconscious. I could hear the deep tones of Cuvier's challenge: find the cause of these events, still reverberating through the sacred halls of science, ghostly, unanswered. I felt Hibben's challenge later on, prodding me to answer all of the facts, I decided that this cataclysmic concept, this catastrophic end which seems to visit our planet time after time, needed verification or refutation once and for all. The first step was to gather all of the known, accepted data from as many Earth sciences as possible: stratigraphy, archeology, anthropology, paleontology, radiology, oceanography, seismology, glaciology, and many other fields. Correlation of the data between the sciences gave the answer, although there is enough data in each science to indicate that these cataclysms happen, there was not enough to prove the concept. But between science correlation showed indeed that the concept was true. Not only did it verify that the events have happened, but disclosed when the last 5 cataclysms were, and what positions the shell of the Earth has been in for the last 35,000 years. So, after years of research, beginning in 1949, Cuvier's challenge had an answer: yes, indeed the cataclysms do happen. And the last one, 6,500 years ago, was Noah's flood. All right. So they happen. What is it that happens each time? The challenge was really twofold: find the process of what happens in a cataclysm, and the trigger what causes a cataclysm to start. What a chase! And what a dramatic story of the Earth's history we uncovered. Civilizations of 20,000 years ago, more advanced than our wildest imagination. Prehistoric legends from Greece, Egypt, India, and South America which became history instead of legend. Lost continents in the Atlantic and Pacific which became dated realities, with logical reasons for their sudden disappearance. Yes, Vishnu came alive, a man who lived through a cataclysm 70,000 years before our time, actually 10 cataclysms ago. Now he is known as the Hindu god of 10 resurrections from the waters. Osiris, too, was rediscovered. He was the Jesus of his time, a man of Egypt, some 15,000 years ago. Noah smiled at us from the pages of the Epic of Gilgamesh. He actually was a Sumerian named Utnapishtim, who lived 6,500 years ago. The ark he built is more than legend. The process of a cataclysm is known now. Look at the cross-section of the Earth inside the front cover. You'll see 2 molten layers, the orange ones. The important one is the thin molten layer about 60 miles thick, which is between 60 and 120 miles down, below the surface of the Earth. The thick, deep molten layer, starting 1,800 miles down at the bottom of the mantle, and extending 1,300 miles deeper, is the outer core. Now both molten layers are liquid. However, the inner magnetic and electrical structure of the Earth makes these layers act as if they were near solid, or plastic. As long as the magnetic and electrical structure maintains its orderliness, this old Earth keeps on rotating on its axis in a normal manner. The growing ice caps Antarctica and Greenland are not centered on the Earth's axis, and, because they rotate around the poles, are trying to swing down to the equator. The only way they could do it would be to pull the whole 60-mile thick shell around with them. As long as the shallow molten layer stays plastic, the shell won't shift. But once every few thousand years the magnetic and electrical orderliness inside the Earth is disrupted, and the molten layer is allowed to act like a free liquid, which it was all the time anyway. It then serves as a lubricant for the ice caps to pull the shell of the Earth around the inside. In 1/4 to 1/2 a day the poles move almost to the equator, and all hell lets loose. The atmosphere and oceans don't shift with the shell, they just keep on rotating west to east, and at the equator, that speed is 1,000 miles per hour. It has to be, normally, to make one rotation per day. So, while the shell shifts with the poles going toward the equator, the winds and oceans go eastward, blowing across the face of the Earth with supersonic speeds, inundating continents with water miles deep. Now what about the trigger? This turned out to be the most elusive piece of the whole puzzle. We couldn't rely on some supernatural explanation like sometime happenings in the heavens of a vague character which actually violated the laws of nature. No, it had to be something natural, a part of nature's ordinary structure, which disrupts the Earth's inner electrical and magnetic structure whenever it happens. We once thought that sunspots could be the cause, because they do disrupt the Earth's inner electrical and magnetic structure, but we were wrong. We found out that nature's power plant is a motor generator system existing in many different magnitudes. It's the basic structure of the universe. The energy structure of an atom is identical to a rotating planet, to a blue T-white star, to a galaxy, to a supergalaxy, to all levels of supergalaxies including a universe and even more. As a neutron which has escaped from its parent atom's neutral zone will separate into particles, a star through a sunspot gives off neutral matter which explodes as it becomes energized. So a galaxy gives birth to an exploding star when a dead star escapes from its neutral zone in the center, and as a dead galaxy explodes when it escapes from the central neutral zone of its parent supergalaxy. A planet, therefore, must act the same at its energy level. So, apparently once every few thousand years neutral matter escapes from the 860-mile radius inner core into the 1300-mile thick molten outer core, and there is a literal atomic explosion inside the Earth. The explosion in the high-energy layer of the outer core disrupts completely the electrical and magnetic structure in both the molten outer core and the outer 60-mile thick molten layer. Finally, the ice caps are allowed to pull the shell of the Earth around the interior, with the shallow molten layer lubricating the shift all the way. You can see, then, that ice ages are not a matter of advancing and retreating ice. It's simply that different areas of the Earth are in polar regions at different times, for different durations of time, with the changes between positions taking place in a fraction of a day. The story around the world gives a silent testimony. The Borisov Mammoth, frozen in mud, with buttercups in his mouth. The age of the gorges below Niagara Falls and St. Anthony's Falls, both about 6,500 years. The sudden end of the Laurentian Basin ice cap in Canada, about 11,500 years ago. The uninterrupted years of evolution on the Galapagos Islands, over 11,000. The geological datings in the Murrumbidgee River Basin system in Australia, showing the end of an ice cap there about 11,500 years ago. The age of fossil bones taken from the Wilshire Boulevard tar pits, over 11,000 years. The sudden end of all work in the prehistoric city of Tiahuanaco, Peru, 9,550 BC, or 11,500 years ago. Leonard Woolley's great work in the Holy Land, dating Noah's flood at about 6,000 years ago. The end of the Wisconsin ice cap, about 29,000 years ago. The sudden 200-foot rise of the oceans all over the world 6,000 to 7,000 years ago. The sudden rise of the St. Lawrence riverbed 6,500 years ago. The changing levels of the shoreline in the Hudson Bay. The granite blocks from the Alps, sitting on the eastern slopes of the Jura Mountains, at 4,000 feet above sea level. The great legendary Ian Fraser's uncovering of over 8,000 separate inundation flood survival legends in the Malay Peninsula region. The Pajak Marsh in Australia, which shows a quick extinction of a civilization 11,500 years ago. The Peri Reis map, showing the North Pole in the Sudan Basin. The Egyptian water clock, showing agreement with the Peri Reis map. granite on top of the mountains around Death Valley in California. The great stratifications of the Grand Canyon, Painted Desert, and Badlands, each layer homogeneous, showing it to be deposited there suddenly by fantastic amounts of water. The computable age of the Antarctic and Greenland ice caps, about 6,500 years. The present growth of the Antarctic ice cap, about 293 cubic miles per year. The legends from primitive man in Tierra del Fuego at the southern tip of South America, of the day the sun set in the wrong direction. The legends from primitive man in Peru of the day the sun stood still. The legends from Malayan and Sumatran aborigines of the long night. The Vav earth strata counts in Wrenshall, Minnesota and Hackensack, New Jersey, which agree. The prevalence of jade in the Orient, which is material heaved up from the mantle near equatorial pivot points during a tumble. The fantastic evidence of a burgeoning tropical population in Arctic Siberia and Alaska, completely wiped out in a fraction of a day. The similarity of languages the world over, from Polynesian to Greek, to Egyptian, to Mayan, to Eskimo, to Yakut, to Oriental, and more. The correlation of ice ages and quick extinctions the world over. The survival of primitive life at equatorial pivot points, the last two being the Malay Peninsula and the Galapagos Islands, now rife with lizards. The existence of a coral reef on the floor of the Arctic Ocean, and more, and more, and more, and more, give us a historical picture of the Earth's shell during the past 35,000 years. The overwhelming evidence, when put in order, gives a dramatic picture of which areas have been at the North Pole, when they moved to the Pole, and how long they were there. Areas of the North Pole. Arctic Ocean 6,500 years ago, Sudan Basin 11,500, 6,500 and 5,000 years ago, Hudson Bay 11,500 and 7,000 years ago, Caspian Sea 29,000, 18,500 and 10,500 years ago, Wisconsin 35,000, 29,000 and 6,000 years ago. Yes, Noah, Adam and Eve, Osiris, Taroa, Zeus, and Vishnu have much deeper meanings now. And, as they join hands and walk with us, we hear Adam and Eve saying, "Listen, for now we can truly share our story with you." The story. Enigma, pursuit, unraveling. It's funny how some things can plague you from childhood through your adult years. Not big things, but little things, which don't exactly persist, but annoyingly stick their head through your life's door and say, "Boo." Just to let you know they're still there. If I made a list of all these things in my life, it might take up a whole book. I'd like to talk about just one of these boos. From the first time I heard the story of the creation and Adam and Eve, it buzzed me, as my young son would say. Now, to me the answer was not simply one of two usual alternatives, either unquestioning faith in the story as it stands, or complete repudiation as utter nonsense. No, the answer seemed to lie elsewhere. If the story were taught as the truth so uniformly, in spite of its apparent divergence from scientific truths, then to me the true course would seem to be a search for the foundation of the story, which would then lead to a true reading of it. The pursuit happened almost by accident. Years of data correlation in studying the Earth tumbling concept has shown the last tumble to have occurred about 6,500 years ago. That Noah, or Utnapishtim, or whatever his name was, did exist and did survive the particular cataclysm. A friend of mine suggested that Genesis 1 is almost a perfect description of conditions on our planet immediately following a tumble. On rereading it, I had to agree. Genesis 2 even mentions that a mist, or flood, went up from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. Well, now, this was worth thinking about. If it were so, then it would be the tumble preceding Noah's another fascinating story. about 11,500 years ago. This, then, could be approximately the time of the Adam and Eve story. The pursuit started. If the story did originate with that temple, in what language was it first written? Certainly not Hebrew or Greek, for as far as we know, they didn't exist at that time. If we look to men such as Don Antonio Batris Jairiki and James Churchward, we may have our answer. Certainly their knowledge of prehistoric languages could be a key, and later we'll discuss the role of Naga and ancient Mayan in the story of Adam and Eve. First, however, let's examine the history of Genesis 1, 2, and 3. There are many schools of thought on this subject, but the most predominant one is that Moses was the originator. This seems not too far-fetched, since Moses was reared in the Egyptian tradition, in a royal household, and probably had access to many religious writings and teachings now lost with the passing of the archives of Egypt, in Alexandria, Heliopolis, and Sais. Certainly the Ten Commandments were a condensation of the 42 questions of Osiris for entering heaven. If Moses did write part of the Old Testament, he then must have had Naga tablet writings, or Egyptian interpretations of them, handed down to the Egyptians for thousands of years, and the Egyptian priesthood had knowledge of a cataclysm 11,500 years ago. Priests of Egypt are supposed to have told Solon during his 10 years in Egypt, about 600 BC, that 9,000 years before that time there was a cataclysm which buried Atlantis beneath the ocean. Note that 9,000 plus 600 BC plus 1,950 AD equals 11,550 years ago. Moses' brother, Aaron, became the first chief priest of the Hebrews about 1300 BC. Somewhere between 15 and 18 generations later, the chief priesthood having been handed down father-son through the generations. Saraiah or Saraias was the chief priest. See the Book of Ezra and 1 and 2 Esdras. In 586 BC, in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Saraiah was taken and executed, and his son Ezra made a captive in Persia. See 2 Kings. At that time, Jerusalem was sacked, and all Hebrew records including their laws and records of the Old Testament were burned with the temple at Jerusalem by Nebuzaradan, Nebuchadnezzar's captain of the guard. In 458 BC, during the 7th year of Artaxerxes' reign in Persia, Ezra was commissioned to re-establish the Hebrew religion and law. According to 2 Esdras, Ezra rewrote the history of the Hebrews from the beginning, and re-established their laws. Now, from 586 to 45 BC is 128 years. The latest that Ezra could have been born was after his father Saraiah's murder, as well could be. See Onan's story, Genesis 38, 8-10. Therefore, the youngest he could have been in 458 BC was 127. He was working on a long memory. Let's examine this anomaly. As mentioned before, the lineage from Aaron to Ezra contains from 17 to 20 generations, including Aaron and Ezra. Assuming 1300 BC for the start of Aaron's priesthood, 1290 BC is adjudged the time of the Exodus. 458 BC to be near the end of Ezra's priesthood. Then we find the average priesthood term per generation to be between 42.1 and 49.5 years. In view of this, can we believe that Ezra served his priesthood for approximately 130 years? It would appear much more plausible to assume that it was Ezra's grandfather, Harazari, rather than his father Saraiah, who was the one taken and executed by Nebuchadnezzar's men in 586 BC. Then Sarah and Hezra would have served as chief priests during the 128 years from 586 to 458 BC, for an average of 64 years apiece. It is even plausible that Hezra's great-grandfather Helchiah could have been the victim in 586 BC, leaving Harazari, Sarah, and Hezra to serve the 128 years for an average of 42 years each, which is even closer to the overall average from Aaron to Hezra, over a period of about 845 years. This means that the Adam and Eve story was last seen in writing by Helchiah or Harazari, therefore handed down verbally possibly by Harazari, and certainly by Sarah and Hezra, and finally dictated by Hezra the 5 scribes. It is the 5 scribes' writings that we have today as Hezra's work. And the English is not even a literal translation. For instance, without form and void, more literally would have read, raging inundations and horrendous winds. Now, through Hezra's reconstruction of Genesis, we are told many things. 1. Because of the usage of tree, fruit, serpent, cherubim, and other words which were glyphs in the picture language of prehistory, it is evident that the creation and Adam and Eve stories were probably originally written in the glyphs of Hagar, the predominant Eastern Hemisphere language of 11,500 years ago. This language is nearly identical to ancient Mayan, and the progenitor of many languages, including Oriental and Polynesian tongues, Egyptian, Greek, and Yakut. 2. Moses and possibly Aaron may have had access to these tablets, or Egyptian versions of them. 3. Neither Moses nor Aaron knew how to read the ancient language, therefore read the glyphs quite literally. 4. Not being able to read the symbolism of Nagar glyphs, in addition to reading them literally, Moses and Aaron, and possibly Hezra, read into the Adam and Eve story the social and religious attitudes of their day. In that time woman was regarded as the root of all sin, a lowly creature, her birth recorded only as an exception, and basically being the cause of man's every downfall of daily potential. This attitude persists in some religions even to our time. Is it any wonder that Eve was shouldered with the responsibility for the downfall of all mankind, as a result of interpretations read into the Nagar by Moses, and into Moses' reading by Hezra? Perhaps also it was read into the story by Egyptian priests long before Moses' time, and passed on to him as history. 5. The fusing of 2 stories, P and J versions, into one to make the story of Genesis 1, 2, and 3 may confuse the man with Adam. It is possible that Adam, being only 9 generations ahead of Noah, with the time span of the Sudan Basin polar era covering 5,000 years, was not the man referred to in the creation, but his name and later experiences were merged with the man's story. Remember, however, we are informed that Hezra dictated the entire history to 5 scribes from memory, and this work contains Genesis as we know it today. For him to recall from the archives of his mind what he did as well as he did certainly bespeaks of inspiration of a high order. But it also appears evident that he had no knowledge of the fact that 5,000 years transpired between Genesis 1 and Noah's flood. It is clear from 2 Esdras 3:9 that Genesis 1 and Noah's flood represented 2 inundations. However, for while speaking of the 2 occasions, he says of Noah's flood, "And again in process of time thou broughtest the flood upon those that dwelt in the world, and destroyedst them." Now, we mentioned before that the lineage of the high priests from Aaron to Hezra differs in number of generations, 17 or 20, and names as presented in 1 and 2 Esdras, and both differ in names from the book of Hezra. We also find differences in the lineages from Noah to Jesus, approximately 51 generations in the Bible. Is it any wonder, therefore, that some generations could have been omitted in the Adam to Noah line and the Aaron to Hezra line? And in the light of the fact that, in addition to overwhelming scientific evidence, there are countless legends in the Asia-Pacific area, handed down from the inundation of 11,500 years ago, of a creation much like that of Genesis 1 and 2, is it not possible that the man of the Genesis story became confused with Adam throughout the thousands of years, and through a succeeding tumble and inundation in Noah's time 6,500 years ago? The miracle actually is that the whole story of creation, and of Adam and Eve, is as undistorted as it is. Being 11,500 years old, it has suffered through many debacles visited upon its guardians in the intervening years. Because of the lack of resolving information, the man and Adam are kept as one in this translation interpretation. 6. The significant Nagar glyphs given to us by Ezra through Moses' direct reading are cherubims, man, fruit, rib, woman, serpent, Adam's sleep, tree, flaming sword. Our knowledge of Nagar glyphs tells us that the tree of life symbolized a mother continent, a parent civilization lasting thousands of years longer than ours of today. An unadorned serpent represented water, or the ocean. A serpent entwined about the tree signified that the mother continent was surrounded by water. Genesis 3:15 actually describes Eve's heel on the serpent's head, showing her victory over the oceans. Cherubims, which were not pretty, plump babies, but hybrid man and beast, were the glyphs for legs, or foundations, or underpinnings. Instead of being placed in the Garden of Eden, one was taken away, and the Nagar or Maya reading of the Egyptian Book of the Dead shows that cherubims of the north, east, south, and west were taken away, meaning that the foundations of the mother continent, in all directions, were removed or destroyed. A flaming sword was the symbol of fire and earthquake. The fire signified what all legends of these cataclysms call earth fire, which is the molten layer below the Earth's 60-mile thick shell breaking through to the surface during a tumble, a literal hell. It is most probably the origin of man's concept of hell, as a matter of fact. Now, back to the tree. Fruit growing on that tree symbolized the original mankind which settled the mother continent ages before Adam and Eve. Their eating of the fruit tells us that they were descended from this original mankind of the continent. Eve eating first signifies that she was the generation after Adam, making her his daughter. His daughter. The glyph of the creation is even more revealing. There are three figures represented in this picture. The top figure is the face of a sleeping or dead person. There were no separate symbols for death and sleep in Nagar. Both were represented as the same. The middle figure is shown as a male, and the bottom figure a female who is represented as the mother of all mankind. In addition, there are curved lines from the sleeping or dead person and the male middle figure to the bottom female figure. This glyph has been interpreted to mean that the middle figure, a male, was put to sleep, shown by the top figure, and a rib or ribs removed from him, the ribs being the curved lines, and fashioned into the bottom figure, the female mother of all mankind. This fits beautifully with the story of Eve's creation, Adam therefore being both the male middle figure and the top figure, a sleeping or dead person. There is a slight hitch to this story, however. The top figure, whether sleeping or dead, is depicted as a female. How could it be Adam, asleep, awake, dead, or alive? Moreover, Imna, Agar, the curved lines denote parentage rather than ribs. So, more reasonably, it appears that the top figure is a dead female, whose offspring by the male middle figure, Adam, was the bottom female figure, Eve, the mother of the Hebrews. So, in essence, the story as read from the glyphs would be that Adam and Eve, who lived in the Garden of Eden in the mother continent, tree, were descended from the original mankind, fruit of the land, which incidentally was surrounded entirely by water, serpent around the tree. Eve was Adam's daughter, and he was a widower. They realized that, in order to survive, they had to leave and never try to return, for the motherland was to be destroyed by a cataclysmic inundation. They left, and afterward, the continent tree was subjected to a fiery earthquake, flaming sword, during which it lost its foundations, cherubims, and sank beneath the ocean serpent, which forever afterward walked over the sunken continent on its belly. So let's review the event 2 cataclysms ago and then apply our knowledge toward a representative translation interpretation of Genesis 1, 2 and 3. It may be the most accurate reading of a story written 11,100 years ago, the event 11,500 years ago. Did you ever sit down for an evening at a card table with a 1,000-piece puzzle? By yourself? It takes hours and hours to put it together, doesn't it, with trial and error and patience all playing their parts. We're still trying out some of the as yet unfitted pieces in our worldwide puzzle, and we've been at the table since 1949. However, even though incomplete, it shows us a graphic representation of the Earth's picture 11,500 years ago. Look at the globe of the world. Pick out longitude 90 degrees west, latitude 60 degrees north. This point is in the western part of the Hudson Bay. Now hold the globe so that 90 degrees west and 60 degrees north is at the North Pole, on the axis of rotation. This was the configuration of the world between 18,500 years ago and 11,500 years ago. The North Polar ice cap formed the Laurentian Basin in Canada. The continents, however, were not quite the same. There was a huge continent in the Atlantic Ocean area, which stretched from Iceland and England across the Atlantic to the Bahamas. The Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea did not exist, they were land at that time. There was another continent in the Pacific, covering an area now ringed by the Hawaiian Islands, the Galapagos Islands, Easter Island, Tahiti, the Solomons, and the Caroline Islands. The province of Ceylon held the major civilization of India. Egypt and the Holy Land were thriving mixtures of vegetation and civilization. Greece, land of the Hellenes, was the home of a tall, blue-eyed, blonde race with standards of science and law unmatched to this day. The Amazon Basin was an inland sea, legends call it the Sea of Xerxes, and the mouth of the Amazon River was then a wide, sea-going connection between the Atlantic and Xerxes. The western coast of South America was not mountainous. The prehistoric city of Tiahuanaco, Peru, now at 12,500 feet above the Pacific, was then at sea level. It was a metropolis seaport, with a canal system for sea-going ships, as large as any we have today, traversing from the Pacific to the Inland Sea. Astronomers of Tiahuanaco used telescopes like ours of today, and they had a huge satellite orbiting the Earth west to east, 449 times per year, which they used as a time standard. Its orbit was so accurate. Ayodhya, now a suburb of Lucknow, was the capital of India. And the great navigators, the great scientists, the great explorers of the Eastern Hemisphere were the dark-eyed, dark-haired Mayans. About 11,500 years ago, in 9,550 BC, as dated by astronomers from Potsdam Observatory from writings in the ruins of Tiahuanaco, the 60-mile thick shell of the Earth shifted its position once more in 1/2 to 1/4 of a day, 7,000 years after the previous shift. The North Pole moved southward, and the Sudan Basin in Africa shifted to the North Pole. This was the time which the Talmud states was the setting of the Pleiades below the horizon, when the Holy Land was moved into a region of terrible cold for many generations, actually for 5,000 years until Noah's flood, 6,500 years ago. The equatorial pivot points were off the coast of mid-Chile and in mid-China, near the Yangtze River, north of Vietnam. The great continent in the Pacific disappeared almost completely. What is now Easter Island, then on the edge of the continent, dropped to remain on the Pacific Ocean floor for 5,000 years, to be heaved up again in the cataclysm causing Noah's flood. What remained of the vast Pacific continent rolled to the South Pole, to be discovered by Mayan explorers as the last remains of their motherland, a frozen reservoir of mud at the bottom of the Earth, millions of square miles in area. Of the great continent in the Atlantic, only a large island was left in the west, while the ocean between there and Gibraltar to the east was left shallow, muddy, and impassable to ships. A thread of a clue concerning the great knowledge of the time came out when Captain Cook discovered the Polynesian Maori tribe in New Zealand in the 1800s. They told him of ancient legends of Saturn's rings, and they hadn't even heard of telescopes. Now you try to see those rings with your naked eyes and you'll find out that it's impossible. The evidence in Tiahuanaco shows that their great civilization was wiped out so suddenly that people were caught in the middle of their normal daytime activities by catastrophic inundation. Further evidence shows that this fabulous city suffered the same fate as Easter Island. Although the Rockies and Andes were started in this cataclysm, Tiahuanaco was buried under the Pacific, to remain there for 5,000 years, then to be heaved up to its present altitude of 12,500 feet in the last cataclysm 6,500 years ago. So the cataclysm of 11,500 years ago saw the Hudson Bay and the opposite polar area just southwest of Australia both rolled to the equator on opposite sides of the Earth, and the Sudan Basin region rolled to the North Pole, to remain there for the next 5,000 years. While this shift was occurring, taking only 1/2 to 1/4 a day to complete itself, the Earth's oceans and atmosphere, through angular momentum, kept rotating in their normal direction during most of the shift, with the oceans violently inundating most of the lands of the Earth, and the atmosphere bringing unimaginable hurricanes of up to supersonic wind velocities. Whole continents were subjected to tremendous upheavals and earthquakes. The molten layer below the Earth's 60-mile thick shell broke through the shell in places all over the world, and was thereafter called Earth Fire by the pitiful few who survived. The oceans and winds took 6 days after the start of the cataclysm to resolve their holocaustic wars on the surface of the Earth, and on the 7th day began to settle down to 5,000 years of normal complacency. The 2-mile thick ice caps of the Laurentian Basin and the Indian Ocean, having shifted from their polar homes and started a new course of revolving equatorially, proceeded to melt at tremendous speeds in the torrid heat, carving great grooves in the mountains as the rushing, gushing, swirling water and ice overwhelmed everything in their paths. The great amounts of moisture being poured into the atmosphere were to shroud the torrid zone in a dark fog for many years during several generations. The oceans rose some 200 feet all over the world with the sudden melting of the ice caps, as they do after each cataclysm. The end of the Laurentian Ice Age, and the start of the Old Stone Age was complete. The Mayan tongue lived on in scattered remnants, Polynesian tongues, Greek, Yakut, Egyptian, Eskimo tongues, nomadic, Oriental, German, American Indian, just about all languages. The resurrection from the waters of Thal lived on in many stories of a man who survived, later to become Taroa, Tongaroa, Taroa, depending on which tribe's legend you find. Adam and Eve could have sprung from the same story. Who knows? Genesis, 4.5 million years ago. This Regenesis is from 11,500 years ago, with both in the Bible. A translation interpretation of Genesis 1, 2, and 3, from a reconstruction of what the hapgood must have been to give us the chapters as we have hid them in English, then retranslating directly from hapgood to English, bypassing Greek and Hebrew. The book of Genesis, chapters 1, liquid 3, 1. In the beginning, 4.5 billion years ago, the universe was created in God's great design. Included was our sun, and our planet Earth. 2. And during one of the many cataclysms that occurred during the Earth's history, this one being 11,500 years ago, the Earth's lands were all inundated with raging waters, and ravaged by horrendous winds. And the oceans were all dark with muddiness. And the ill wind thundered over the troubled waters also. 3. And as the storms abated, sunlight came back to the face of the earth, as God intended. 4. And, while the Holocaust was abating, once more darkness and sunlight were re-established and distinguishable, and it was good. 5. And sunlight was again daytime, and darkness again nighttime, in accordance with God's design, and evening and morning made one day. 6. Again, God's original design was that there be a sky between the clouds and oceans. 7. And in accordance with God's design, the heavens were re-established, in that the sky again stood between the clouds and the oceans, as the onslaught of the great storms abated. 8. And God's heavens were indeed re-established, and that evening and morning were the beginning of the second day. 9. And God's design was that the lands would not be entirely covered by the oceans as they were immediately following a cataclysm, so the disrupted oceans, now settling, drained off the higher lands. 10. And, in accordance with God's design, the dry land was earth, and the waters oceans, and once again it was re-established and good, as God intended. 11. And since God's design was that the earth should bring forth grass and herbs, yielding their seed, and the fruit yielding fruit containing its seed, and the earth was again re-established. 12. Therefore the earth, being re-established, brought forth grass and herbs, yielding their seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit containing its seed, and it was good, as God intended. 13. And the evening and the morning were the start of the third day. 14. In accordance with God's design, there were normally lights in the heavens, which served to indicate months, and seasons, and days, and years. 15. Also they served to furnish light on the earth, as God intended. 16. And as the great fog lifted, and the clouds broke, the sun and moon reappeared, and also the stars. 17. And once again, as God intended, they shone from the heavens. 18. And the sun and moon again were able to divide light and darkness, which was good. 19. And the evening and the morning were the start of the fourth day. 20. And it was God's will that some of every creature living, and bird flying, should survive the cataclysmic inundation. 21. Surviving then were great whales, and every living creature of the sea, and every kind of winged fowl, and it was as God intended, and good. 22. And they were blessed with God's original design to be fruitful, and reproduce, and replenish the oceans with sea life and the air with fowl. 23. And the evening and the morning were the start of the fifth day. 24. And it was God's will that some of every creature, cattle, and creeping thing, and beast of the earth, should survive the cataclysmic inundation. 25. Surviving then were the beasts, the cattle, and everything that creeps on the earth. And it was as God intended, and good. 26. And in accordance with God's design, man, who was created in the image God intended, also was to survive, and have dominion over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. 27. So it was God's design that man, who was created in the image God intended, both male and female, would survive the cataclysmic inundation. 28. And they were blessed with God's original design to be fruitful, and multiply, and replenish the earth, and control it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. 29. And God's design was that man, being given every herb bearing seed, which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree, in which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed, to man it should be for food. 30. And to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, wherein there is life, God's design was that green herbs shall serve for food, and it was as God intended. 31. And everything which survived was as God had originally created, and still was in God's design, and was good. And the evening and the morning were the beginning of the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were re-established, all the host. 2. And on the seventh day the recovery from the Holocaust and flood were complete, and the seventh day brought rest from the fight for survival against the Holocaust and its after effects. 3. And the seventh day brought God's blessed peace, as the Holocaust had abated, leaving those of his creation who survived. 4. These are the same regenerations of the heavens and of the earth as they were re-established after the tumble previous to the one of this story, when the Lord God re-established the earth and the heavens. 5. And every plant of the field before that cataclysm was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew. For the Lord God had not brought rain upon the earth in this region, and there was not a man to till the ground. 6. But there was this cataclysm, and great inundations arose over the earth. 7. And it was God's will that man should rise up from the earth, and keep the breath of life, and remain a living soul. This is his story. 8. And it was God's will, after a cataclysm, that a continent eastward be established, and there in Eden lived the man of this story. 9. And from this land grew other civilizations, on other lands, with the motherland in the midst of all being the seat of wisdom, of all knowledge, both good and evil. 10. And the inundation destroyed Eden, and left only its 4 offspring lands. Note, the next 4 verses are probably incorrect, with the true description locked in correct translations of Egypt's Book of the Dead, and the missing portion of the Peri-Reis map. 11. The first land is near the river Basin, which includes the whole land of Avila, where there is gold. 12. And the gold of that land is good, there is bdellium and the onyx stone. 13. And the second land is near the river Gihon, the same land which includes the whole land of Ethiopia. 14. And the third land is near the river Hiddekel, that is the land toward the east of Assyria. And the fourth land is near the river Euphrates. 15. And it was in God's province that the man was of Eden, where he lived and toiled. 16. And he was descended from the original mankind which settled that motherland. 17. And God's design was that the man was warned, although the motherland was the source of all knowledge, both good and evil, if he stayed therein, surely he would die. 18. And it was God's design that the man should not be alone, therefore a mate should be his. 19. And since God had originally created every beast of the field, and fowl of the air, and in his time Adam had named each one. 20. And Adam gave names to all cattle, and to the fowl of the air, and to every beast of the field. But for Adam there was no mate. 21. For Adam's mate had died, after giving birth to a child of Adam. 22. And the child of the man was a female, made in the image God intended. 23. And Adam said, This child is bone of my bone, and flesh of my flesh. And she grew into womanhood. 24. Therefore, the man was both father and mother to her, and she abode with him, as they were one flesh. 25. And the climate there was warm, requiring little or no clothing. 1. Now at the time of the beginning of this story, the oceans were in their normal state of quietness, and it was known to the woman of this story that she was not descended from any of the peoples of the lands which sprang from the mother continent. 2. And God's design was that the woman would learn that the people of the offspring lands would live on. 3. But the people of the motherland, from whom she had descended, would surely all die. 4. And she knew that in spite of the impending inundation, she would not surely die. 5. For God's design was that from the day she was born, she was descended from the original mankind of the motherland, and was destined to know all, to discern both good and evil. 6. And the woman, being of the motherland, and being wise and good, knew that both she and her father were descended from the original mankind of the motherland. 7. And they both were wise, and had lived a good life, and it was the time of the year when some clothing was needed for warmth. 8. And in the cool of those days, when they were wondering to which of the offspring lands they should go, and God's presence was felt strongly by them. 9. Adam felt God's call. 10. And said, I have heard God's warning since the summer, and have feared, for I knew not where to find refuge. 11. And God's warning had come to him in the summer, as a warning to leave the land of his ancestors. 12. And the man said, The woman who is my daughter, and descended of my ancestors, gave me this knowledge. 13. And asked her, What gift of knowledge has God given you? And the woman said, I am of your ancestors and inherit their wisdom, and the coming inundations of the oceans has been made known to me. 14. And God's design was that the oceans would so inundate the lands, and drown all cattle, and all beasts of the field, and bury all dust. 15. And God has thus given me victory over the oceans, such that the seed of future generations is in you and me, for the oceans will drown all others. 16. And God's design was that although the inundation would greatly multiply her sorrows, she would even so bring forth children, as her love would be for her husband, and his for her. 17. And unto Adam it was God's will that he heed the words of his daughter, and God's warning that though they be descendants of original mankind of the motherland, they should leave it, as it was destined for destruction, and pipe were they to stay, surely they would regret it. 18. And where Adam was to go, the land would be difficult to farm, with thorns and thistles abounding, and even so the herb of the field was to be their food. 19. By his own toil and sweat he was destined to fight the fight for survival after the inundation, even to the end of his days, when he would return to Mother Earth, as it was earth man came from, and unto earth he shall return. 20. And after the inundation, Adam therefore made the woman his wife, and called her Eve, as she was to be the mother of all living from the motherland. 21. And, again after the inundation, as they were in a colder climate, It was God's design as part of their survival that they make coats of skins and be clothed. 22. And it was God's design that Adam should take with him the knowledge of good and evil from the motherland as he put forth and left in order to live. 23. Therefore, in accordance with God's will, he left the Garden of Eden to survive and live from the soil where he was to go. 24. So the man left, and the Garden of Eden was subjected to a cataclysm of earthquake and fire, and the motherland lost its foundations and sank beneath the oceans. Conclusion. India, Greece, Egypt. When Indra, king of the gods, had destroyed the Titan who held the waters of the earth captive in his entrails, he returned to the heights of the central mountain with the song of the rains and running waters in his ears. But where his dwelling once stood, he saw only ruins and ashes. So he summoned Vivekaman, god of works and arts, and asked him to build another palace to match his powers. The architect set to work. Soon towers, buildings, and gardens rose among lakes and woods. Indra urged him forward impatiently. Each day he called for some fresh marvel, new delight for the eyes, walls more imperial, pavilions more richly adorned, statues greater in number and cunning. A fever seemed to burn in him. And Vivekaman, exhausted by his labors, decided to lay a complaint before the Creator of the world. Brahma received him, gave ear, approved, and went to plead his cause before Vishnu, the Supreme Being. Help was promised. Soon a young Brahmin appeared at the king's palace and demanded audience. Charmed by the light of his eyes, Indra granted his request. "O king," said the messenger, "thy palace shall be the noblest of all." These words were sweet to Indra's ears, and he rejoiced. Vishnu's messenger continued, "It shall be the noblest of the palaces which the Indras before thyself sought to build." The king became uneasy. "Dost thou say that there were other Indras, other Vivekamans before ourselves, other palaces before mine?" "Indeed yes," the youth answered. "I have seen them. Moreover, I have seen the world arise and vanish again, like a tortoise's shell coming out of infinite ocean and sinking back. I was present at the dawn and the twilight of the cycles, past counting in their numbers, nor could I count all the Indras and Vivekamans, even the Vishnus and Brahmas, following one another without end. Brahma Vavata Purana and I Krishna Jamakanda. O Solon, you Hellenes are but children. There is no old doctrine handed down among you by ancient tradition or any science which is hoary with age, and I will tell you the reason behind this. There have been and will be again many destructions of mankind arising out of many causes, the greatest having been brought about by earth fire and inundation. Whatever happened either in your country or ours or in any other country of which we are informed, any action which is noble and great or in any other way remarkable which has taken place, all that has been inscribed long ago in our temple records, whereas you and other nations did not keep imperishable records. And then, after a period of time, the usual inundation visits like a pestilence and leaves only those of you who are destitute of letters and education. And thus you have to begin over again as children and know nothing of what happened in ancient times either among us or among yourselves. As for those genealogies of yours which you have related to us, they are no better than tales of children, for in the first place, you remember one deluge only, whereas there were a number of them. And in the next place there dwelt in your land, which you do not know, the fairest and noblest race of men that ever lived, of which you are but a seed or remnant. And this was not known to you because for many generations the survivors of the destruction made no records. Plato, Timaeus Psalm 4:6, spoken by a priest of Egypt. Therefore will not we fear, though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea, though the waters thereof roar and be troubled, though the mountains shake with the swelling thereof. Knowledge can be a dangerous thing, or it can be a vibrant seed giving rise to verdant forests and awakening sleeping giants. The author, Mr. Thomas, attended Dartmouth College and Columbia University, receiving a degree in electrical engineering from the latter in 1943. As a result of his research since 1949, Mr. Thomas has become recognized as the world's leading authority in the field of cataclysmic geology and its relationship to uniformitarian geology. In 1959 he applied his findings to the possibility of earthquake prediction, and at a seminar in November 1959 issued the results of his studies. He then accurately forecast the months, years, and locations of the major African and Chilean earthquakes of 1960, the Iranian earthquake of 1962, the Yugoslavian earthquake of 1963, and further predicted that California would have no major earthquakes for the following 5 years. His correlation research in the fields of stratigraphy, vertebrate paleontology, radiology, oceanography, glaciology, seismology, paleophilology, earth magnetism, anthropology, and other related fields, has demonstrated that the cataclysmic geology theories as presented by Deluge in 1779 and Cuvier in 1812 are definitely more acceptable than they have been previously within international scientific circles. Mr. Thomas' definitive efforts in integrating the various earth sciences have distinguished him as the only American today with such a specialized scientific forte. His research in paleosciences has led to new explanations of such enigmas as the Pyramid of Khufu at Giza, the ancient cities of Tiahuanaco and Baalbek, and the giant statues of Easter Island,